Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm Park Howell, and today you will learn how to use the ABT Agile Narrative Framework to make your complex messages simply land right the first time, every time. As you probably know by now, I co-authored with Dr. Randy Olson the second book in what is now a 5-book series based off of his initial book called The Narrative Gym. We wrote the Narrative Gym for Business to show business leaders just like you how to amplify the impact of your branding, your sales, and your marketing using the ABT Agile Narrative Framework to differentiate your offering and exponentially grow your sales. 2 additional books followed: The Narrative Gym for Law and The Narrative Gym for Politics, co-authored with Randy by Doug Passon and Dave Gold, respectively. The next book out is called The Narrative Gym for Science Graduate Students and Postdocs. But don't let the title fool you. This is a remarkable book on how to use the ABT to simplify your complex messages so everyone in the room gets you. You'd think they'd quote a scientist for social proof on the cover, right? But no, they used a quote from a business guy, the legendary Silicon Valley marketer, Christopher Lochhead, who said, "Nobody buys a solution without an effing problem." Here's his full quote.
So you gave me a gift with the ABT. You know, in category design, we have this thing called a POV, a point of view. And it is simply structured very similarly to that of the ABT. It's so simple, you can't imagine how profound it is. In a point of view, it goes like this: nobody buys a solution until they have a problem. And so a point of view starts with articulating, framing, naming, and claiming a problem. Well, we can relate to that problem. That then sets up the solution. And when people understand the problem/opportunity, then they become interested in the solution. And then, of course, the third piece from a POV perspective is how your product or service, or your idea for that matter, you might not be actually marketing or selling anything, bridges the gap between the problem/opportunity and therefore the solution. Okay, so with all that said, why do I love the ABT? Here is a simple, insanely powerful way to write an instant POV. And that's why the and, but, and therefore model is pure genius. It allows you to relate to people. Then it gives them the but, which tees up the problem. And then the therefore, which points the way to the different future, aka solution. And so it's pure genius. And it's easily rememberable. And if you start to play with it, as I have since you taught it to me, just like anything else, you develop some prowess with it, starts working. You're like, wow, it's almost weird how this works.
So why start a science book with a quote from a business person, especially when most scientists hold great disdain for the sales and marketing world? Because, well, we all are in sales. It doesn't matter if you're trying to get a prospect to buy into your product, your service, your vision, your mission, your initiative, or to fund your science study or support your experiment. You are selling. There's a great deal the science world can learn from the business communications world, and vice versa. And there is no more powerful narrative framework to use than the ABT to make your complex messages simply land right the first time, every time. As you'll hear from 2 scientists, the co-authors with Randy of the 5th book in the Narrative Gym series.
If you don't tell your story, someone else will tell it for you, and you might not like how they tell it. And I think that's really resonates with our students and with the business world as well, is if you are not going to complete this story and represent your research, yourself, or whatever else you're trying to present to your audience, someone else will do it, and you're probably not going to like how they present that information. And that is really important for science, is because some of the work that we do, especially myself, is controversial, and it might be challenging some long-held paradigms in our field. And if I am not going to go out there and be a voice or a representation of that information and present that information in a way that is consumable, then people aren't going to be able to understand what that is, and they're going to say something that might be misrepresented. If we don't close that loop, then someone else will do that, and we're not going to like how that is presented. So we really need to be effective with how we're presenting information.
That was Dr. Keisha Bahr, who joins Dr. Marlis Douglas to explore how the science world is now using the ABT Agile Narrative Framework to communicate their big ideas. Keisha is a coral reef ecologist and an assistant professor of marine biology at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi. Over the past decade, she has experienced several coral bleaching events and watched entire reefs die. After traditional methods of science communication, via publications and so forth, failed to create change, she quickly realized that the future of our coral reefs relies on the scientific community's ability to communicate with the public. But many graduate students and researchers lack effective communications trainings and therefore skills. So Keisha has been on a conquest to improve communications in science to increase the effectiveness of the management of our coral reef ecosystems. Dr. Marlis Douglas is an endowed professor in biological sciences at the University of Arkansas since 2012. Her conservation genetics and genomics research on fish and wildlife informs management and guides conservation planning across the globe. The ABT framework is her essential tool to translate complex scientific data into simple, actionable solutions that address real-world problems. Marlis and Keisha believe that scientists are curious and quite creative, and if they are good at storytelling, then they can persuade that science can help. But scientists are bad at storytelling because they are too detail-oriented and don't think about how to relate to non-scientists. Therefore, training scientists in storytelling helps them focus their messaging, and the ABT provides an agile framework so scientists can be part of the solution and not the problem. So please welcome to the Business of Story, Drs. Marlis Douglas and Keisha Bahr. Marlis and Keisha, welcome to the show.
Wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. We have gotten acquainted by working with Dr. Randy Olson through the many ABT framework courses he's done really since the pandemic hit, when all of us, in-person training and keynotes and whatever got the kibosh, and he put together this very remarkable 10 one-hour session course called the ABT framework. And we were working primarily with scientists and researchers and academia throughout the pandemic. And I think he just sent a note out saying he is now on his 29th course, and that would be with the World Bank starting up next week. So as mentors and as coaches and guides with the ABT, we've all learned it from Randy, and we've all had a hand in sort of refining it as we go. As the old saying goes, as you know better than anybody else, you don't know what you don't know until you teach it. And we learned so much about the ABT and working with those scientists, and literally hundreds of hours now of training in his story circles and so forth. And then you two got together and wrote the book, The Narrative Gym for Science Graduate Students and Postdocs, which is now the fifth book in a series that he started during the pandemic called The Narrative Gym. And then I wrote the second book with him, The Narrative Gym for Business. And now he's got Narrative Gym for Law and Narrative Gym for Politics. And yours is the most recent edition. And I got to tell you, I read through it in preparation again for this. And, I'm a guy that thinks I know everything about the ABT because I've been working alongside Randy for a decade on it. And every time I read something about it in a different perspective, I learn 2 or 3 or 4 new things. So thank you for that with your excellent book. And that's what we're going to be talking about on today's show. How did this book come about, and what about the title? Let's start there. Who would like to run with that?
Well, okay, I can start with how did this book really start out, because Marlis and I have been teaching the ABT framework to our graduate students at our universities. And we kind of took what Randy was doing in his working circles and through his online training and implemented that in our own courses. So here at A&M in Corpus, I teach a communicating science course. So I was like, this is perfect. I took this course. Let me try to instill that and integrate it into my class. And Marlis did a similar thing with her graduate students. And at the time, we were figuring out alongside everyone else, like, how do you really implement this? And then, like you said, we realized well, at least I realized, I can't speak for Marlis, but I realized I didn't know as much as I thought I knew about the ABT until I was actually teaching it and leading these students. I felt like blindly leading these students down this path to the ABT and really trying to integrate all of that into this course. So then Randy found out that we were teaching it and he wanted to learn more and how it was going and what we were learning from that. And other people were starting to contact Randy about teaching the ABT. So he said, hey, we should write a book about this. And I was like, yeah, that sounds so simple. Let's just write a book about how to teach. So, I told him, yeah, I think that's a great idea. And we kind of scoped out this entire thing. And in academia, you're just so busy all the time that was always something that at least I wanted to do. And then I don't think it really it caught flame or took fire until Marlis came on. And Marlis was like, let's do this. Let's get this going. So that's kind of how this process went. And we wrote this book in, was it 3 weeks or a month? It was very fast, very intense, right in the middle of my fieldwork season. But, having that team, having Marlis, having Randy, we really played off each other's strengths and weaknesses, and we pulled this thing together. And now we're hoping it's a resource not only for graduate students, but also for postdocs or anyone else who wants to learn about the ABT framework. And it has more specific ways to really implement the ABT into different ways and different trainings.
And Marlis, this book is very specific on the title. So, for instance, my book with Randy was The Narrative Gem for Business. Doug Poisson's book was The Narrative Gem for Law. Yours isn't just the narrative gem for science, but for science graduate students and postdocs. How did you arrive at that specific title?
I think one thing is that, scientific training takes a very long time. You do a bachelor's, a master's, a PhD, probably you're 15 years in school. And you learn all the technical aspects, how to analyze data, how to collect data, how to do scientific writing. But what you really don't learn is life skills or, kind of dealing with normal people, non-scientists, the rest of the world. And so the more we do it, the more we do our science, the worse we become interacting with non-scientists. And this is really essential. And I recognize this kind of for many, many years teaching with students. And in my own research, having to deal with a lot of, agency folks and stakeholders and so on, and trying to relate my research to people who are not scientists. How do I talk to them? And so I started teaching a professional development course where I use actually a lot of elements I find from the business world, lots of very practical skills. And the thing is always, why reinventing the wheel when other people already have figured out how it works? So communicating with diverse audiences is really very essential for today's scientists, for their training. And it really isn't done. There is really not a simple framework, as simple as the ABT, to do this. And as you work with grad students, and for example, we try to teach them how to an elevator pitch, like you do in business, kind of at the conference, what do you do? And so they can just very briefly explain, well, I'm working on this, but this is the problem, and therefore I'm looking for this solution. And I always tell students, very simple, concise, don't expect the elevator to be slow or even stopping. So we really thought that's the group which needs this type of training most. They have to communicate with audiences. They have to go out there. A lot of today's students actually say they want to have an impact on the world. And the world means not just scientists, but everybody else. And I think if we as scientists can communicate better with the rest of the world, I think science can actually contribute to the solutions and not just cause more problems. And so this is why we specifically aimed it at this group. But I think any scientist will benefit from reading the book. We just said, well, it's really for this group. They should learn it so that they're equipped when they go out in the job market. But I can recommend it to anybody who is already a scientist if they're not already very familiar with the ABT framework.
In our line of work, I always talk about with business leaders and sales and marketing folks that their job is to make the complex simple so that their prospect, their buyer, their customer, their colleagues can immediately get it through that singular narrative of the ABT. And it just makes the whole sales process so much easier when your audience doesn't have to fight for meaning. Keisha, when did you recognize the ABT? Can you take us to that moment where you went, wow, I didn't know that this existed, and I've got to do a deeper dive on to see how I exactly can use it in my work?
Yeah, well, I will say that I had been struggling to find a way to be more effective in my communications throughout my graduate degree. And part of my discovery from learning more about what Randy's training was, it was sent out one of our listservs of, hey, there's this training, it will help you be more effective. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. I want to take it. And also it was free, which is a huge, hurdle for graduate students. We don't have any money. So I was like, well, I want to be more effective because I want to create change, like Marlis was saying. I want to raise awareness that our coral reefs are dying. And I'm not very effective at doing that because it's all doom and gloom. Like working with corals is so challenging. They're dying. It's not working. We need to make change. So I learned about the ABT from Randy directly. And then I started going back and reading more about his books and more of the development of ABT following that training. And it was in the first class that I took with him where I was like, oh my gosh, I have been doing everything completely wrong. I start out with the negatives. I use bigger words than I should when communicating with people. And I kind of go in all these different directions. And it's hard for my audience to follow me. And I didn't really realize that until when Randy broke down the ABT and talked about the contradiction and talked about the setup and the solution. I was like, oh my gosh, I actually kind of felt a little embarrassed that I had been such a terrible communicator up until that moment.
Yeah, but you're a passionate, creative scientist, but you're never taught how to communicate, correct? I mean, even in the business world, when I first saw the hero's journey and what Hollywood knew about storytelling, which then led me to the 5 primal elements of a short story, which ultimately led me to the and but therefore, these 3 powerful words that play off the 3 forces of story, of agreement, contradiction, consequence. And that was in 2011 in Randy's second book, Connection. That was my aha moment. I'm like, oh my God, could this thing really be that powerful? It was, like the golden chalice in branding to make a complex message simple. And that was my wow. Okay. And then Randy and I became fast friends and have gotten to work together now in the past decade. Marlis, when was your aha moment with the ABT in the complex science world, making your messages simple, digestible, land right the first time?
I think my journey started a very long time ago, actually, when I finished my master's. And one day, and we relate this story in the book, one day my mom asked, so I just probably came home for Thanksgiving dinner, and she said, so tell me, what did you do for your master's? And I was super excited telling my mom, and so I started, I'm studying baby fish, and they have little experiments in the lake, and I have to wear thermal underwear type of layers in the dry suit, and it's very cold. The water is 6 degrees Celsius, and it's freezing cold, and I have to go down there and and then the results were all the baby fish died, but that wasn't a really big deal because and I used a very fancy term we use in evolutionary biology. Basically, it goes down to if you have a piece of pizza, you can either make a few very big slices and give each kid a big slice, or you can make a lot of slices, but each slice can be only very little, but then you can feed more kids, right? And it's like with a mama fish making eggs and giving egg yolk to the baby fish. It's basically like dividing pizza. She can either make a few really, really big eggs and make big baby fish, which then survive better, or she makes a lot of little tiny eggs with little tiny baby fish, and they die because they don't have enough yolk to grow. So anyway, I had all these exciting stuff, used a lot of jargon, blah, blah, blah. And then I finished and, expectantly looked at the mom, and she looked at me and just said, "And people find this interesting?" And I was really, "Mom!" And it's, of course, right now I'm a much better storyteller than what I used to be back then. So I try to make it a little bit better for the people of your podcast so they don't turn off after, kind of 10 minutes into the podcast. So anyway, but this really made me realize that if somebody who really loves you, he's really genuinely interested in what you do, and you cannot communicate what you actually do, you have a problem. And so I went on this journey. How can I become a better scientist, communicator? And I came across Randy's book, Don't Be Such a Scientist. And this title really says it all.
I love that title. Yes. Isn't that the best? Don't be such a scientist.
Yeah, it's just so concise, but really hits the nail, because it's really, in order to communicate with the rest of the world, you do not have to communicate like a scientist. Scientists like detail. They just convince each other by giving tons and tons and tons of detailed data. And then, the others look at this and they understand each other, and then they can figure it out, and everybody's on the same page. But that doesn't work with most people, so we really have to reduce the detail. Now, Randy's initial book, Don't Be Such a Scientist, said really what we do wrong. But back then, that was, I think, almost 20 years ago, he didn't really have the best solution yet. How can we address this problem? Until he came about this ABT. And so then when I found out that he was teaching that course at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was really looking into improving my communication skill, that was kind of my one strategy for that year, I thought, I want to take that course, do whatever it takes. And it was really one wow moment after another, but also because there is so much in there that I realized I didn't grasp it all. So I tried to do it with my students, frustrated them to no extent, because I wasn't a very good teacher. I didn't understand it myself very well. And so when Randy taught it again for open, not for a specific group, I said, I want to take it again. And, then each time, each session, I understood so much more. And each time, of course, I wrote Randy an email, said, wow, this is so fabulous, this visual you had, or this or that. And so then he said, well, why don't you join the group and help me with teaching this thing? Because you really seem to be very interested and enthusiastic. And so this is how I became part of the group, and Keisha very similar. So, and this really has been an eye-opener, I think, with a few new things we have in the book compared to, the previous editions. They are very, very essential for scientists. And I think the listening aspect, the trying to think, where does your audience come from? Why should they care? Why does it matter to them? I think that's one of the most important aspects scientists need to think about, so they can start that conversation, and then get into the rest. So I think that was really, and this is what I now try to teach our students as well. That way of thinking, listening. Mm-hmm.
Marlis, do you use your mother as a touchstone to think, how can I make my mom care about what I'm ready to present to these 20,000 people in the audience, or 20 people, or 2 people sitting across from me? And how can you use storytelling in the ABT to do that? I mean, that must be a nice little touchstone to go back to.
Yeah, unfortunately, my mom is no longer around, but, I try to use it with anybody else. And for example, the pandemic was a lot of hardship for a lot of people, a lot of very difficult situations. But one thing I discovered is one meets a lot of neighbors, because a lot of people decided, I go for walks, kind of get away from Zoom screen and from indoors. And so you meet neighbors, and neighbors come from all disciplines, do all kinds of things, and you start talking with them and have some time. And that really was a very good practice. Each time you meet somebody completely different, I would never meet at the university. and you start talking with them. And then each time you have to think, how can I make this relevant to this person? And then you listen. So what's really the problem here? What's really the question this person has? Or why is this the solution to the problem? I didn't quite understand the problem. So it really helps you prime thinking when you are in dialogue with anybody, basically.
And helps you get out of that and non-narrative, quote unquote, storytelling, which really isn't storytelling. It's just a spewing of a lot of facts in a linear fashion that you did with your mom. And then you've got the and, but therefore, set up problem resolution, set up complication. How do we solve for this? All right, Keisha, can I put you on the spot?
Yes, of course.
You are hanging out in Marlis's neighborhood. It's the pandemic. You're out walking your dog, and you come across a neighbor who you didn't realize was also a scientist. And when they ask you, how do you communicate your big, complex ideas and make it simple? Because, of course, that's the natural question that's going to come out over, the back fence there. In 1 minute, how would you explain the ABT to them?
Well, first, I would start out by just giving a general background about coral reefs in general. So how they're important and what kind of services they provide. And then I would introduce like a broader question that I have, a problem that we're seeing with corals. So I would first start out really, really broad. Coral reefs are really important. They provide these services, but they're threatened because of these changes that are occurring in our oceans. Therefore, I am investigating how do we reduce these impacts that we have. And then from there, I actually take a nested approach, start very, very broad. And based on the feedback and the interaction I have with Marlis or the neighbor, I would go into more detail to see and kind of evaluate how much information do they know or what they don't know, and then kind of pivot in that direction. So if she was like, well, what do you mean by corals? Then I would kind of go into more details about what exactly corals are and how they build these large structures, but we really don't understand how they build those structures and what kind of conditions they need. Therefore, we're looking into that and so on and so forth. So I would say that I take a nested ABT approach when I talk to anyone, actually, about my research. I start really, really broad because then that builds that bridge, that common ground between us. And then it allows you to kind of pivot and step in deeper or kind of sidestep to what kind of information do they need or how are they receiving that information based on what they give back to me. So that back and forth of listening for them.
In that and statement of agreement, you're very careful about using just one or two ands in that. And we can talk a little bit about the if-then clause and so forth. But it's about setting up that positive outcome. It's here's what we all like. In the book, you talk about Matt's template. And Matt is a part of the overall teaching cohort here, too, with the ABT of heaven and heaven, but hell, therefore, take action. So what you're doing with that and statement of agreement around coral reefs is how beautiful they are, how important they are, and what they produce for nature and for ourselves. So that's that statement of agreement. But the most inciting word in the English language means we have a plot twist, but we have a problem that you are now exploring and working on. And therefore, here's what a better tomorrow can look like if we take this action.
Exactly. And I would say if I was talking to someone completely outside my circle, I would probably establish the and statement a little bit broader. Like we all love going to the beach and we really enjoy our beachside condos, right? But the reason those might be impacted because there are these changes that are occurring in our ocean. Therefore, let me tell you a little bit more about these natural protections that we have. So I think it's, like you said, Park, it's all dependent on who you're talking to. And that and statement allows you to set up and really build that bridge to your audience to say, hey, you really care about this thing, or you really want this to continue in this way, but this is threatening that, or this is the problem, and let me offer you a solution to really engage and get that investment from your audience.
Absolutely. Now, Marlis, how do you explain or describe the ABT to a new scientist or a new student, postdoc, graduate, whatever? How do you quickly explain the structure and the use of the ABT so that it lands and they get it right away without them pushing back and saying, I'm already too smart for this stuff. I don't need that stupid 3 little word story framework. It can't possibly work.
Yeah, I think what I would say, scientists are general very curious and creative. And if we would be good at storytelling, then we could translate this creativity, this curiosity to help solve the world's problems. But we as scientists are really bad at storytelling because we're too detail-oriented, too nerdy, too focused on details. So therefore, we really have to learn a new approach, how we can better communicate our science to other scientists and also to anybody else. And the ABT provides this framework because it tells us what information to provide, be very specific, very simple, one issue at a time, what context to place it in so that it matters. Just focus on this one issue, and then they explain what we can do about it and how we can do about this. And this structure basically helps you structure an elevator pitch, a presentation, an entire dissertation, because it really tells you what to put in, how to structure it, in what format, and how to pitch it in a positive or negative way.
Now, in the work that I've gotten to do with you all and Randy and these groups of scientists and researchers during the pandemic, Randy has a lot of fun when he trots me out as the business guy. I'm like the evil villain among scientists. And he's like, yet listen to him because you can learn a lot from business and how we communicate when we want to be as simple and compelling as possible because we are competing with all of that other advertising noise out there. And you know what? Scientists are in the same position. They are competing with all of that noise out there. So from some of the work that I've done with you all, what are a couple of the highlights that you can think of that from the business world you are now incorporating in your science communication via the ABT and your other storytelling methods?
I can go first. I actually have quite a bit. When I think about how science is most related to any other field, the first thing I think of is business. So when you gave your lecture for the course, I was like, oh my gosh, I see so many parallels that it's shocking. What we do as scientists is we kind of like to remove ourselves from the science that we do and be very objective about it. But in reality, that's not the case, because when you present any kind of information or you try to secure grant funding, you have to sell that idea or that problem to your grant funders, or you have to sell that idea to a publication or to your audience. So like you're essentially selling your research without really actually selling it. You're trying to obtain that funding to conduct the work and really convince people that there is a problem and that you are the right person to provide that solution. So even that mindset of selling ideas or problems and solutions is a core backbone of business. And at the same time, I think one of the most powerful things that I learned from the business world and from your lecture in particular, Park, was the commercials of making the audience the hero. Like that completely blew my mind. And it's still examples that I use today. And I've even shared with people who, like some of my peers, my colleagues, just showing the examples of how effective commercials are when they put you or the audience at the center of that. And we can take that same approach with our own presentations or our proposals. If you take away, it's not about you, it's about this problem or how the audience can help you solve that problem, it really gets that investment from your audience and it really helps drive home or help put motion behind what you're trying to do. And I think that hasn't really been something that's been communicated in science before. It hasn't been really integrated into how to be effective in communication, but that's really getting the buy-in. That's getting that know your audience quote that everyone uses. That's really getting that buy-in from the audience to help you solve that problem. So I could go on, but those are like the two main things that I'm continuously like, how am I representing the research that I'm doing? How am I connecting with my audience? How am I raising awareness around these issues? All about centering around the person or the consumer, I guess you can say.
Well, Keisha, don't feel bad because in my training, I will come across, 3 decades experienced chief marketing officers, and they have that same aha moment. Oh my God, this story is not about us. It's not about the brand. It's not about what we make. It's always about the audience and what we can make happen in their life. the outcome. We all get so enthralled with our own research and our findings and our widgets and our inventions that we think, like Marlis's mom is going to really think it's cool. And then when we completely, just focus on what we've found and what we've created, Marlis's mom says, and people find that interesting until we can communicate, actually, what's the outcome? Here's what we get. Oh, now that's interesting to me. So you're not alone in that, Keisha. Marlis, how about you? What were some of your takeaways from the business world?
I actually view it as a very, very positive thing that you're part of our training group, because that perspective you provide is so essential. And it's really, and you make it so clear because you're a master at the ABT. So when you told us your science, or you as a scientist, are not the hero of the story, it's your audience, or your client in that sense. That was really one of these wow take-home moments. And especially in the course, this is followed by Diana Padilla, who actually then translates these concepts into how scientists should write proposals for funding. It's a very essential part of what we do, getting funding for our research. So hearing first your perspective and then Diana's, how this is directly translated is very, very impactful. And one aspect of the ABT I find so powerful is that once people know about it, it's like a common language. And it makes it really easy to talk to somebody in science, because I can say, so what's your context? What's your agreement? Or what part of my agreement do you not understand? How do I have to rephrase this? And I think that makes it very powerful. And I think, in the course, we teach groups from FAA, the flight administration. We teach people from World Bank, which are mostly engineers, and being able to talk all these different groups, including business people, makes it really exciting that we can exchange ideas, that we finally talk this common language by realizing how we have to structure our messaging, and that we have to be very simple and concise and not use any big words, any nerd jargon.
Nerd jargon. I like nerd jargon. Speaking of nerd jargon, I try to explain, and I'm not doing a very good job of it, I'll tell you right now, to the business world, the whole Dobzhansky singular narrative concept. So now I'm coming to you, the science world. Help me do a better job of describing and explaining what that is. How would you do it? How do you get people to really understand what that's about? Where did it come from, and how do we use it building ABTs?
I'll let Marlis take this one.
Oh, you chicken. Come on, Keisha.
Yeah. You addressed it in the book. Well, the one thing is, first of all, Dr. Dobzhansky, he was an evolutionary biologist. And, his name is very difficult to spell. Most people misspell it, including me. I had a typo in the book, actually. And, Keisha has a story about the Bob Jansky. Some people refer to him that way. So he was an evolutionary biologist. And what he said, this very famous quote is, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. What this meant, we have this diversity of different creatures, and they're adapted to these different ecosystems, and they can survive in extreme conditions. And how does this come all about? And evolution really provides an excellent explanation about the processes, the mechanisms which allow this diversity to come about. And then, like now with change, global change, climate change, other change, how hopefully organisms can adapt to these new changes. And so it's really, when you look at the context, in which context do you have to see these complex problems, these patterns? If it's evolution, this is the context, then it makes sense. And it's really kind of, again, it comes back to the agreement. What is the context within which you have to explain to your audience a specific issue you want to address? This one specific topic you want to talk about today. And so I always tell students, whatever it is you work on, nothing makes sense except in the context of. So frame it, if it's the pandemic and this is why you can't focus, or like what Keisha said, what happens to the oceans might impact your beachfront property. So it really helps you finding the context, and that's what's so relevant in reaching your audience. That's really the key to it.
And that context is important. We call it the singular narrative. In his case, the singular narrative was all based on that one word, evolution, and then he went off and wrote a complete thesis on it that really had scientists viewing evolution in nature in a whole new way. And so what we try to do with the ABT is when we first write that big conversational ABT, we have lots of stuff going on. That's just the chore of writing. You get your thoughts down and you end up with 2 or 3 or 4 different narratives. You don't really have a single focus, but you're just getting your thoughts down on paper. And then you can use this Dobzhansky template to say, okay, what's the one word that I'm really working here for? What is that one thing? And in the book, The Narrative Gym for Politics, it was introduced this whole concept of a Christmas tree. So Keisha, I know you talk about that in your book. Let's expand on this Dobzhansky template and the Christmas tree metaphor.
When it comes down to the Dobzhansky is it's all trying to find what is that framework or that core narrative that you're trying to say. And the way I like to frame it is what is the Christmas tree, the outline of that. And that allows you to start positioning and talking about other main components that you want to address in whatever research or story that you're trying to tell. And we like to call these ornaments, or these are the elements of the main issue that you're trying to address. So the way that I like to pitch this, and it's actually extremely effective in structuring any type of work that you're doing, if you're presenting something or if you're writing something, is to come up with what that Dobzhansky template is or what that Christmas tree is. So for example, for my work, it would be climate change. So that's the core narrative behind all the work that I do is climate change. And there's all these other impacts of climate change that are causing corals or other animals to be responding in a certain way. So each of my ornaments would be a different main point that I'm trying to make from this framework of climate change. Another way that I like to pitch this, and it's been really effective for my presentations, is just trying to start overall, what does the Christmas tree look like? And then you have different pieces that you talk about within each of those ornaments. So for example, if you're doing a job interview, you really want to get this job. That's the core narrative. And in order to get that job, you need to provide all this evidence that you are the great person, you are the right person for this job. So each of your ornaments would be an aspect of how you are the perfect candidate for that position. Either in our world, you have tons of publications, you have tons of funding, your research is really innovative, and these would be ornaments on your Christmas tree that you present. And the reason why this is extremely important is because if you just list all this information, it's hard for your audience to really understand what you're trying to say, versus if you present, hey, I'm going to tell you about this Christmas tree that I have, and I'm going to tell you about each of these different ornaments that we have in this ABT structure, is extremely, extremely effective. And it also helps you organize and present information that is relative in that framework, instead of just ornaments all over the house kind of approach.
So Keisha, do I have this right if we go back to the Dobzhansky template for your work? Nothing in coral reef health makes sense except in the light of climate change.
Correct. And what I would even say, if you wanted to be broader and if you're trying to have agreement with your audience, then I would say ocean change.
So it would be in light of ocean change.
Correct.
And then you would support that through climate change and whatever, but you are going to keep coming back through, be it your presentation, your grant proposal, your thesis, whatever it is that the ocean is changing. It is impacting the health of our reefs, and most of it is the cause of climate change. So
Correct.
Then here are a number of different problems that come out of this ocean change. Ocean change, ocean change, ocean change.
Correct. And the reason why I say ocean change park is because if you go up to somebody, you say climate change, it could be off-putting to them, or they might shut down. So that's why I say ocean change, because it is changing. We know it's changing. And then we could talk a little bit more about climate change once we have that agreement and buy-in from our audience.
why it is changing. Yeah, that's a really great point. And it goes back to that whole concept of know your audience and communicate from their point of view. If you were in a room with a bunch of climate change folks, then you could certainly have that be your central core narrative to what is happening to the depletion of the coral reefs. If you're in with a bunch of climate deniers, then you switch that frame. Your message doesn't essentially change, but your frame certainly does. Now you're going to be talking about ocean change. Why is it changing? Well, climate change is one of the impacts on it, but they are agreeing like, okay, the ocean is, and you're not going against their already deep-seated beliefs, whether they're into climate change or not. You are just going, so that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, correct. And I think that's one of the biggest things is, especially dealing in a controversial topic as my own, is being able to pivot and have words that mean similar things, but also allow for that agreement with your audience and bring them on this journey with you without shutting them down right away.
At the very beginning of your book, Randy did a courageous thing, as you all did with it, and you included a quote from a business guy, Christopher Lochhead, who I've played at the beginning of the show so everyone could hear the context of that quote. And he comes down to essentially saying no one buys a solution unless they have a problem. And that is true in business, and it's certainly true in science. So he also goes on in that quote that talks about framing, naming, and claiming. And that's what the ABT does so beautifully. Again, he's speaking from the business brand development world, and the most important thing you can do in branding is own a little piece of real estate in your prospect's brain that you can defend, that they will keep bringing you up and thinking, about you, in addition to all the other things they've got going on in their head. Well, the same is true, of course, in the science world. And the ABT is great at this framing, naming, and claiming, because what you just said right there in that statement of agreement, the setup is framing the situation we're in and what we all really care about and really want. And then we name that problem. But here's why we don't currently have it. And if we don't do this, then it could get even worse. And then the claiming, the final of, and here's how we believe we need to be moving forward. And so it's just everything that you were doing in the science world lines up so well in the branding, sales, marketing world. And I guarantee you, if you, and I would love to see you maybe do this in one of your classes, go into your classroom and ask, how many of you in here are, graduate student, postdoc scientists? Everybody's going to raise their hand, right? Then you say, how many of you are in sales? And you're going to see at least 2/3 of those hands go down. And then you say, you drop the but bomb. But I hate to tell you, you are all in sales. If you are trying to get anyone to buy into your way of thinking, feeling, doing, studies, give you money for the grant, whatever, get that first job, you are in sales. And the big butt bomb plays an important role in that. Marlis, would you like to cover the butt bomb for our listeners?
Yeah, the butt bomb. That was really a fun one. So it came actually from one of my grad students. In science, we rarely use the word but because we find it very abrupt, and indeed it is. And that's the whole point of in the ABT, that it's a very, very abrupt change. But he said the word but reminds him of another thing, an anatomical part, which is spelled with two T's. And so this is why he avoids it. And so I was thinking about this, especially with this element of the math template. First, you have to paint a positive picture if you want to reach to your audience. And so you do this with this if-then element. If we do this, then the world will be beautiful. Or if you do this, then we don't have any problems, and so on. And then you want to pivot, to get to the problem, get to the but. And I always envision this. You first have this calm world, like very placidly, beautiful. And then you drop basically a rock into it and make a big splash. And the funny thing is, a butt bomb in German is actually what we in English refer to as a cannonball. When somebody jumps up into the water and pulls their knees and makes themselves small into a little like a cannonball and jumps in the water, makes as big of a splash as possible. And this is really a very good analogy how to convey to the students, how the before and after the butt should be different. Placid, nice, basically heaven first, and then you drop the butt bomb, and then it's hell. And so that they really have this concept of how big the contrast has to be, so they can find what key elements they should put in the setup versus then the but statement.
God, I love science. I never knew that our cannonball is known in German as a butt bomb. I think that's just so much more appropriate, don't you? Which then leads me, of course, to the next thought, and that is people don't like to use the word butt because they're afraid they're going to sound like an ass, right? So that's where, there you go.
Yep.
Well, you're right. The butt bomb is so important because essentially what we're doing with the ABT is we are opening a story loop, inviting our audiences into that story with that statement of agreement, setting the stage. And then, as Randy has done a lot of research on that, where that but is the number one most important word in the English language, he believes, because it signifies in that story loop a plot twist, which then triggers that limbic brain, which is pattern-seeking, cause and effect, decision-making. Oh, my God, I thought we were going here, but now we're going there. What the hell? How are we going to end this thing? And so we have to close that story loop with the therefore, or our call to action, or here's the action that we need to take next. And if we don't close that story loop, if we leave it wide open, being non-narrative or not really completing our ABTs, then our audiences will close it for us. And as I tell my business folks that I teach, if you don't close it, they will leave with a story you did not intend unless you intentionally tell them a story and close that loop. There's another person, Keisha, that you refer to in the book that kind of elaborates on this a little bit more. Can you go into that for us?
Yeah, and before we talk a little bit more about that, I like to joke around and say that like how powerful the but is, because when I'm in my lectures, I will just start saying but, and just if I see my students like kind of nodding off, I'll just like but, and they're like, and it doesn't even make sense why I'm saying but they'll just pay attention. So I think that's really strong evidence of how but actually does change the way that you're perceiving and moving your information forward.
Keisha, it's so funny that you say that because I find myself doing the same thing when I start like blathering on. I go, oh my God, I'm boring myself. What am I doing to these people? I will throw a random but in there, and then it makes me do that jujitsu move of, all right, I've got to go in another direction that's still relevant, but keeps them interesting.
At the same time, you actually can use like reverse psychology with the ABT. Like, sometimes with your spouse, your partner, you have these arguments. You actually talk about the same thing, but everybody said, but blah, blah, blah. And what I learned is sometimes then you go back and forth and discussion doesn't go anywhere and the argument is really about nothing. And I realized from another person, Brian Palermo in the course, that if you replace the but with, say, yes, and, it totally changes the dynamic of the discussion, even though you can still make this statement, but you just use the opposite word of but. And that really then moves the conversation forward. And I think scientists in general are very argumentative, because this is how we learn, this is how the scientific process works. One idea versus the other, one set of interpretation of data versus the other. So the but thing is really essential. But it doesn't work with most everybody else. So in a way to help promote a conversation, drop the but and replace it with an and. It works both ways.
And you mentioned Brian Palermo, who is a stand-up comic, had been a member of the Groundlings comedy troupe in Hollywood for many, 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 many years, a very, very accomplished Hollywood actor and stand-up comic, and that's so much fun seeing these kinds of characters. And I will call him a character because he makes me laugh every time I talk to him, that Randy brings into this group, teaching all the different facets of the ABT. And that circles me back to that question I was going to ask you, Keisha, about Dr. Shirley Malcolm. You mentioned her in your book, too. And what Shirley's Law is, I think, is so interesting.
Shirley's Law is if you don't tell your story, someone else will tell it for you, and you might not like how they tell it. And I think that's really resonates with our students and with the business world as well, is if you are not going to complete this story and represent your research, yourself, or whatever else you're trying to present to your audience, someone else will do it. And you're probably not going to like how they present that information. And that is really important for science, is because some of the work that we do, especially myself, is controversial. And it might be challenging some long-held paradigms in our field. And if I am not going to go out there and be a voice or a representation of that information and present that information in a way that is consumable, then people aren't going to be able to understand what that is, and they're going to say something that might be misrepresented. And as you were just saying, Park, if we don't close that loop, then someone else will do that, and we're not going to like how that is presented. So we really need to be effective with how we're presenting information, because we're probably not going to like it if someone else represents us or represents our information.
Well, in our world of branding, Jeff Bezos, I thought, said it really well when he says a brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. So I co-opted that, and I say a brand is the story people tell themselves about you when you're not in the room. So you want to really control that narrative. And it's got to be a truthful narrative. You can't put BS in there, because the truth will surface. And that's the beauty, again, of the ABT from my standpoint, the way I look at it. It makes you place that audience at the center of the story. What is it they want relative to what you have to offer, and why is that important to them? So in just that first statement of agreement, you are demonstrating to your audience that you care, because you've done your research, you've done your discovery to understand who they are and appreciate what they want and why that's important to them. But you don't currently have it, which now demonstrates your understanding and your empathy for why they don't have it and the impact that is going to have on them. Therefore, you are building trust in those first two statements to help you pay off that third statement of consequence. Therefore, I believe I've got a way forward for us if we just do this. It's just a beautiful little, an atomic bomb of messaging in a very smart little compact. That's a really horrible analogy, I know, but it is so powerful. Keisha, just like you said, when you were losing your audience and you throw a butt randomly in there, look, all of a sudden they've lit up and now you've got their attention again.
Exactly.
All right. I could talk about this forever, and we're running out of time. Two last thoughts from each of you. Marlis, what have I missed that you want our listeners to know about the ABT in the science world or in their world?
Coming on this podcast, I was thinking about, so how can I make it relevant to your listeners? And I listened to some of your podcasts, and I was really very excited. And I listened to more, like 379, How to Humanize, High-Tech Storytelling by Carrie Nelson. I thought that was very, very helpful. So she deals with this kind of issues. And then also How to Define Your Brand with Daniel Nestle. And I hope that the book, even though it's branded for grad students and postdocs and specific scientists, that some of your listeners in business still will be looking into it. Because I think we are scientists. All who wrote this are scientists, except Randy has also kind of filmmaking background. But we really know the mindset of scientists. And we hope that your listeners can use what we outline in the book. And we really try to not write it technical, not using the nerd speak, to make it really relevant, that they can use this either to learn better how to talk to their technical teams, Or maybe they can give a copy to, some of their technical folks, if they're IT people or developing, technical aspects or so, that they can become better engaging with the rest of the company. You have these meetings, and then sometimes you probably think, oh my God, today is this meeting where the tech people give us their newest thing, and now we will see graphs and, and it will be awful. And if those folks learn how to better engage with the rest of the company, or the salespeople can say to the scientists, hey, can you structure your talk as an ABT and see, look, this book here? That will give you some ideas how to do it concisely. I think that will be a great achievement. So I very, very much hope that it will be of use to your listeners as well.
Keisha?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to add, because Marlis summed that up really, really well, and that connection across, like connecting different worlds and be able to communicate across these worlds with the same framework, but different types of information, I think is extremely powerful. And this is a really great example of that. And one thing we didn't talk about, but I think it's a really important thing, is the ABT can help instill confidence in yourself, and also confidence in what information you're sharing or what you're selling. Because based on how you structure that information, you're going to get buy-in from people. And if you structure the information based on this sound science, that allows you to connect better with your consumers, with your audience, and that instills confidence in yourself, in your business. And it does the same thing with scientists. It gives us more confidence in like, hey, we are doing an effective job at sharing the science and the information that we're generating. Same thing with business. Hey, we're doing a really great job of understanding our consumer, telling them they have a problem or showing them that they have a problem and providing the solution for them. So I think confidence is one of the biggest things, is you're able to reframe and restructure information, share that with your audience, and get feedback from your audience that they understand what you're saying. Because that's what we all want. We want everyone to understand what we're saying to them. And I think that ABT can do that.
Park, you have been a very great teacher. So therefore,
thank you.
Keisha and I want to be put in a little plug for our book. So what we will be doing is offering a teaser, kind of the highlights of the book in a webinar, and then probably do a little practice session with the working circle. We have this as one of the appendices, how to do these working circles, kind of how the group of people, they don't have to be in the same discipline, just a group of people work together to structure ABTs. And so we will give a teaser of this online via Zoom seminar on January 5th. We haven't decided on the time, but we will announce this. And so we hope that some of your listeners who are curious about the new book, the new elements in the book, will listen into it and or encourage others, in their company, maybe the tech people and the scientists to participate. So we really want to spread the word in the science world, and also how others who deal with scientists, how they can use the information in that book. What I also would like to say, I'm very, very grateful to Randy to have brought this insight, this knowledge to the science world, and then also people like yourself who have expanded it to other disciplines and make us now better communicators with everybody, actually.
So then I have a request for you to, when you have the link to your webinar, send it to me, and as soon as you have it, and I will put it in the show notes here so anyone listening can go to the show notes and be able to click on that. And this is a free webinar, is that right? They're able to come in and learn from you all and the other participants.
Typical scientists, we're not good at thinking, business strategy and selling stuff. Hey, there is this knowledge. We sell it for free. Yeah,
that is a great strategy right there. Give it away. Get them in.
Yeah.
Get them bought in that way, and then they'll see how powerful it is, and they can lean on you for other stuff down the road. Well, thank you both for taking the time. I know how busy you are. We're leading right up to Thanksgiving, so life is particularly nuts. But thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us. This was great fun, and we look forward to continue working with you in the ABT framework course with Randy.
Me as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Park. We've learned so much from you, so we really appreciate your insights.
That's so nice. Thanks for sharing that. What I learned from you today, besides the butt bomb, and now I'm going to do a butt bomb instead of a cannonball the next time I jump off a high dive, is something occurred to me. And now with your new book in this 5-book series covering different disciplines, it occurs to me that when I'm working, and I work with some large companies like Home Depot, Walmart Canada, Intel, and the like, that the C-suite can benefit from the ABT from these different books. So I could walk in and say, all right, Chief Marketing Officer, Head of Sales, Sales Enablement, read the narrative gym for business. And then I could turn around to the C-suite attorneys in there, the law, the legal team, read the narrative gym for law. Then I could run into HR and the diversity and inclusion folks and say, you might find the narrative gym for politics particularly interesting, and how do you connect diverse people and find that common ground. And then, of course, I would go into research and development operations and innovation and say, you know what, you ought to read the new book out, The Narrative Gym, for science grads and postdocs. And what we would be doing is they would be looking at the ABT from all of these different angles and yet build that common storytelling language, because they would all be using the exact same framework, but just for different means. Doesn't that make total sense? Randy could package that as a package deal, just going into C-suites. I love it. Anyways, there was an aha moment that just hit me in this conversation. So thanks for spurring that. And thank you all for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you like what you heard, or if you are confronted with that very logic-driven, reason-thinking research and development, maybe it's a coder, maybe it's your IT people, and you're having the hardest time in the world communicating with them, share this episode, because Marlis and Keisha have done a marvelous job of demonstrating how you can take this logic, reason, complex thinking brain and simplify it using just this simple ABT. And by all means, get their book. Get the book in their hands. And they are going to see that this is how you communicate with Homo sapiens, us storytelling monkeys, that we use story to make meaning out of the madness of being human beings. And in all of the work I've done in my 35 plus years of branding marketing world, starting with the hero's journey, boiling it down to those 5 primal elements of a short story for big impact, an anecdote you can tell in under a minute to make your business point, I have learned that it all begins with building your narrative intuition with the and, but, therefore. So with that, feel free to share the show around. If I can be of service to you, come on over to thebusinessofstory.com/ABT and learn more about how you can put this messaging marvel to work for you. And until next week, when we will have some more amazing storytelling artists just like Marlis and Keisha right here for you, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make sure that's a great one. Thanks so much for listening.